I'm Duncan McLeod, and this is the TechCentral Show. TCS is brought to you by MTN Business. Visit mtnbusiness.co.za to learn more about their products and services. And we thank them for partnering with TechCentral to bring you these great interviews. Our guest in the studio today is Daniel du Plessis. Daniel is Communications Director at a Pretoria-based company called Milkor, which is a global defense solutions provider. Milkor recently concluded the development and test flights of its new Milkor 380, which it says is the largest drone, or technically UAV or unmanned aerial vehicle, to be fully developed on the African continent. The drone has a flight time of up to 35 hours and can be used for border surveillance, maritime surveillance, strategic reconnaissance, and information gathering operations. Daniel, welcome to the studio. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I don't know much about Milkor. I see it was founded in 1981. Tell me about its origins. Was it a spin-off of Naval or one of those organizations?
So Milkor was established in 1981, as you mentioned there. It was derived for manufacturing of weapon systems predominantly for the South African Defence Force back then, under a certain jurisdiction as a private company. So owned, developed, and the OEM manufacturer, the original equipment manufacturers of the revolving grenade launcher. So all of the 6-shot grenade launchers that you find in Hollywood movies and things like that, typically stems from the South African origin.
Okay.
And our company then started supplying these systems, continued doing so past changeover into democracy, started supplying to the rest of the world, to more than 56 countries. And then in 2015, 2016, the company was invested in quite heavily in expanding its capabilities beyond just weapon systems, but then also to other portfolios such as air, land, sea, and cyber, and hence why we are here
And
today.
still headquartered in Pretoria.
Still headquartered in Pretoria. We have a few global offices now as well. So we have some offices in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, predominantly responsible for regional marketing activities, local support, and developments of our naval platforms. So we have a dedicated team and shipbuilding facility that can accommodate shipbuilding up to 35 meters for various different types of operations, ranging from personal use or private use to coast guards and navies as well. Alongside that, we also have a regional head office in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. We also have some offices in Poland, in Warsaw, and also in Colombia. In Bogota, we also have some offices.
Interesting. Okay, is that where your clients are, your biggest clients are located?
It's where most of the regional support comes from. So for example, these 4 strategic offices are first and foremost there to facilitate ongoing contracts and local support of the existing equipment we have. But then beyond that, also facilitating regional support. So for ease of travel, I think it's very difficult to travel to the Latin American market. Having a person stationed there, travel in and out of the countries, it's better to do business, especially dealing with government. It can be on quite short notice as well.
Okay. Now, just to go back to the founding in the 1980s, obviously that was the height of apartheid. I presume that that this was in response to the sanctions that were in place at the time. I know there was a lot of investment by the apartheid government back in the 1980s in military systems. So this, I imagine, came out of contracts with the SADF because we couldn't import the military equipment that we needed to fight the border war, for example.
Correct.
Is that right?
So that's correct.
Okay.
So Arms Corps, back then it was called TechCentral, essentially gave a mandate to Milkor as a subsidiary, a private investment company under Mr. Andries Piek, who's long retired by now, to develop this.
Is he the founder?
He's the original founder of the company, original owner as well. And then, so he started off with the development of the multi-range grenade launcher, the 6-shot grenade launcher, specifically for lethal applications, specifically for the SADF under that regime.
What does a 6-grenade launcher do that a single grenade launcher does not? What are you able to achieve with it in a military setting?
So in the very first instance of it, right, it was the Milkor Mark I as the first iteration of it, and developed in 1981, then first sold and delivered to the South African Defence Force in 1983. And since then, they've kept on supplying it. It was renamed internally into the SADF and still being used in the SANDF as the Y2 grenade launcher. Essentially, it's a 6-shot grenade launcher, semi-automatic weapon system that is capable of firing up to 400 meters. It's capable of firing ammunition that has an impact radius of 12 meters and a lethal radius of 5 meters. So it uses 2 different types of warhead systems. There's a small grenade projected 400 meters, and upon impact, it essentially allows you to have a fragment head or a dual purpose head, which has a shape fuse charge for armor penetration.
So you can shoot this thing at a tank.
Not necessarily a tank, but it can cover more than 70 millimeters of steel. So, for example, light-skinned vehicles or armored vehicles, for example, would work. Tanks usually have reactive armor and much thicker armor plating as well, so it won't necessarily damage the tank, but it might do some damage to the subsystems. But it's predominantly used for urban combat scenarios, area clearance and area suppression activities as well. And you typically have a multitude of these weapon systems fire sequentially. So you are able to fire 6 rounds within 3 seconds with proper training. That is the training that we also provide as well. But yeah, quite commonly used. And then since democracy, obviously, a lot of countries took note, implemented by very well-known entities like the Navy SEALs and things like that as well. Also using similar equipment, spin-offs of the same technology that was developed in South Africa. Since then, we've also upgraded that specific portfolio to accommodate for a multi-range 6-shot grenade launcher, which is called the Milkor Super 6. That weapon essentially accommodates 2 different types of munition systems, so either low velocity or medium velocity. That is, on the medium velocity side, capable of reaching distances of effective range of up to 800 meters. Same explosive power. Now, that weapon system is much more modern. We have supplied that to the SANDF as well under the Y4 grenade launcher project, under Project Kamachelo. And subsequently, it's also been used around the world by a multitude of government entities, specifically infantry fighters, in either guerrilla warfare or jungle warfare type scenarios.
Okay. I imagine there are a lot of global restrictions on this industry. It's not an industry I know well, but I imagine the trade in these products is very heavily restricted. How does that actually work in practice? I mean, you must spend your days interfacing with people in governments around the world, but actually shipping these products around, including it into active war zones, what is actually involved in that?
So the regulation from South Africa's side, since we are headquartered in manufacturing still under the South African legislation, is dictated by the NCACC. It's essentially a body, a national interministerial committee that is established to regulate the sale and export of arms from South Africa to the rest of the world. Now, this interministerial committee essentially comprises out of I think more than 8 ministers and more than 9 deputy ministers, all advising with their respective responsibilities pertaining to national security risks and political affiliations that they might have. So there's a few regulations from the get-go that I think might be important to note. Number one is that we do not supply to active war zones. That is a government stance, and I fully support that.
So if the Ukrainian government or the Russian government would phone you up and say, we want this product, you can't supply to them?
100%. Correct. And I think that is a good stance that the government took. Right, South Africa is at the southern part of the world. We have a very alive and well defense industry that I think has moved from a public entity more towards the private sector, like our company as well. So a lot of the skills and knowledge we still retain within the country, meaning a lot of the equipment we provide is still world class. So the things that we do export then needs to be used by governments ethically. And South African government, alongside the Directorate for Arms Control and this interministerial committee, also allows for the regulation of these things. It's highly regulated. There's a multitude of processes you have to go through, and they have to give approval before we supply anything. So makes our lives difficult in terms of business that we have to do, but I think it is a good stance and it's well governed.
Good. So, of course, the multi-grenade launcher is not the only thing you do, although I think that is your most popular product, right?
It's our most well-known product.
Most well-known
so I think because of the legacy behind it and the fact that we were the original equipment manufacturers of it, we are often regarded still as a weapons company, although we have branched out significantly into other portfolios as well. I think the perception is shifting, and I think that is what we are trying to achieve as well. It's not just a weapons supplier, but essentially a defense solutions supplier that is essentially capable of developing systems that can support a complete solution comprehensively to address a certain challenge that the government might have.
And you say the industry's doing well. I mean, I hear names occasionally. As I say, it's not a space that we cover usually here at TechCentral, but I hear names like Paramount. I hear names like Daniel, obviously, which I know is going through a very difficult time, and others. Is it a good industry to be in? I mean, is it profitable? Do you make good money? It's. I mean, we're sitting at the tip of Africa. You don't normally associate Africa with defense contractors, defense manufacturers. But you're suggesting to me that it's actually a good business to be in.
So under the sanctions during the apartheid government, there was a lot of locally developed skills, all right? And there's a lot of people that had to then rely on the South African defense industry specifically to be able to do the operations they needed to do. Now, whatever negative stigmas and things that might be around that, Naval was then tasked to fulfill the same purpose for the SANDF, the South African National Defence Force, from the chains of democracy. Since then, the skills and knowledge retained within the Naval entity has slightly shifted because of a lack of funding from the SANDF side, meaning no orders for Naval.
Massively shifted, I'd imagine.
And subsequently moved to a private sector. Yeah. Right now, this has also led to a large outflow of skills and knowledge developed in South Africa, people with more than 30 and 40 years of experience in various different defense solutions, moving to countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, and some Asian countries as well, or moving on to Europe-based defense suppliers, which are doing quite well as well.
Okay.
So the limited resources that were left behind, people that did not move or immigrate to a different country, then was retained within the private sector. And that sector is doing extremely well. So South African defense industry, governed by the African Maritime and Defense Association, is essentially an organizational body, government body, that represents the entire public and private defense industry. This, I'm speaking under correction, but I think it's more than 150 companies that belong to this organization, spearheaded and predominantly responsible for more than a few $1 billion worth of exports to predominantly the African continent. So South Africa, in a large context, is still seen as a feasible partner politically and regionally, allied with many different states on the African continent, and a reliable partner when it comes to defense solutions and security solutions as well. I think it's predominantly shifted from just outright war equipment, but more to modern security equipment, essentially for defense capabilities.
Let's talk about those other solutions you've had. We've spoken about the multi-grenade launcher, and we're going to talk in more detail about the UAV, but I see you're also involved in land and sea products as well as cyber solutions. Maybe take us through those areas.
So we've established these portfolios in a sense to address a larger defense solution capability within the company. When we approach governments, we have often found that a weapon on its own will not be able to solve the complete problem. And therefore moved into domains like land, sea, and cyber domains, which is more commonly known, and a larger market as we progress in technological development. So the land systems, for example, have been alive since 2017. We've started the development of the first armored vehicle last year during the African Aerospace and Defense Exhibition, which is the largest event on the African continent for these types of systems. I think it has more than 60,000 visitors in more than 39 countries.
Even I've heard of it, yes.
Yes, 39 countries. It's a huge event that we also partake in. We usually also sponsor part of this event to make sure that it's successful and they have the funding they need to do it. But a part of this event essentially is to showcase new technologies. And so we've recently launched in our land division specifically 2 new additional vehicles for light tactical operations based on existing models that you might find. And then also a more built-for-purpose type armored personnel carrier that can also be repurposed for an infantry fighting vehicle dedicated specifically for UN peacekeeping operations. So as to assist governments on both ends, right? So having a domestically operated APC or armored personnel carrier, then also having some light tactical vehicles that can be used by either police, securities, or security industries within the interior, and then also for border surveillance as well. And then when they need to go out and assist with UN peacekeeping operations or regional peacekeeping operations, there's another offering as well. Now, subsequently to that is also not just supplying the vehicles. We have to have an internal capability of integrating a multitude of different sensors and other capabilities for different configurations of these things as well. So we've had to establish quite a well-established team from a technological point of view, both in the command and control sphere, which incorporates different communication methods, tracking methods, navigation systems, that needs to be integrated in that sense as well. We've partnered with a few South African companies that assisted us with that as well. And beyond that, also some field ambulance capabilities and weapon systems that need to be incorporated in this. So it's a fully fledged division now with a really large product offering, capable of addressing a larger concern, built for purpose type vehicle rather than a one size fits all type of vehicle. So really proud of that division. I also helped drive that division in terms from a market end towards the right direction and grow it significantly. So I'm really proud of what we've achieved. The next division was the naval section. We started off with a naval vessel specifically designed for long endurance surveillance operations, right? The naval sector is extremely difficult to enter into. There are companies with more than 130 years experience in just building ships. It's one of the most commonly used type pieces of equipment in a defense environment, specifically for navies, with some navies being active since the early 1500s. So we entered into a very niche market specifically to address some of the surveillance capabilities predominant in South Africa, but also to the rest of the continent.
It's a full product, a full ship.
Yes. So
how big is it?
This vessel was a 12-meter vessel. It was built on a catamaran-style design.
Unmanned.
It is also now unmanned.
Okay.
I'll touch on that now, but essentially built it so that you have all the equipment and facilities you need to stay out on the ocean for 5 days continuously, having the necessary sensors, radars, Doppler sensors, depth sonars, things like that, to be able to do a full surveillance capability along a coastline. So close to shore, inshore, essentially less than 12 nautical miles offshore.
How do you decide to go into a market like that? Is it you must do a thorough analysis of what's available on a worldwide basis and say, okay, there's this product in this space, but it doesn't address this and this. Therefore, we think there's a market gap, and we're going to go for it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So what we identified in this specific sense is that many of the navies around the African coastline specifically, right, especially in the West African side, have larger OPVs, so offshore patrol vessels, that they then use for inshore patrol operations. Now, to run these things, you have a crew of at least 20 to 30 people. The boat is 60 meters. The operational costs is through the roof. So we've identified a certain market that with a smaller vessel, a lighter vessel with a smaller crew, you essentially can perform the same type of operations for a fraction of the cost. And essentially having more of these systems available allows you to reduce your cost and actually use the boats that you have in your arsenal on your fleet for the right purpose, what they were designed to do. So since then, after launching that vessel, we moved our naval headquarters to the UAE, where we now also have a fully dedicated design and development team with a manufacturing facility in Abu Dhabi, and then also started branching out on the naval portfolio, right? Addressing same philosophy, addressing how can we develop systems that helps save on operational costs and ensures operational efficiency. So we've recently at IDEX, which is another defense exhibition, we usually use these shows to address and announce new things. It's because it's on a global stage. So we launched a completely new division for the naval systems, now comprising, I think, of more than 12 different vessels, ranging from 6 meters in size to 35 meters in size as well, which is what our manufacturing capability allows us to do. So the next one, I think, that will finish production and prototype development with qualification alongside Bureau Veritas will be the Milkor Commander, high-speed interceptor patrol vessel, specifically for the Coast Guard applications.
When you say high speed, how fast is it?
So all our vehicles are actually dedicated to high speed. The Milkor IPC that I mentioned previously, the very first one we developed, has a top speed of 50 knots.
Wow.
And a cruise speed of 30 knots. So essentially it is built on a design philosophy that as you move up in speed, the hydrofoil that sits underneath the catamaran reduces drag, lifts the boat out of the water, and essentially allows you to cruise at 30 knots for optimal fuel efficiency and achieving a range of more than 350 nautical miles. Same philosophy went into the Milkor Commander, which is the new vessel we're launching as well. That'll be completed, I think, by the end of this month. We'll finish the full trials and everything with that. Also a top speed of 45 knots, so a very high-speed vessel, specifically used for maritime issues that are faced not just in Africa, globally. What we found is that in engaging with end users and governments, respectively, there are more similarities in maritime warfare than any other domain around the world, right? These can include illegal trafficking of goods, so either smuggling of illicit items, drugs, various different things. I mean, in some cases they smuggle maize or oil, like food oil, because of the scarcity of it. It's an illegal operation. Human trafficking is a global issue, a global pandemic at the moment.
Particularly around Africa.
Particularly around Africa, but also in Asia as well.
Okay.
And a lot of these activities are predominantly done from remote areas which are not normally patrolled. They don't have a harbor or port to essentially enter into. And then they move out from these remote shorelines on small dinghies or rubber boats or inflatable boats out to a larger vessel that is either anchored, waiting to enter into the dock, and then dropping the goods, essentially bringing it to shore. This is a common practice, right, along the Eastern African coastline, really large. Piracy activities around the East African coastline is also a huge issue.
It's still ongoing, is it, around Somalia and those areas?
It's still ongoing. The Italian Navy, alongside the UN in Somalia, specifically addressed a lot of these concerns and had great success in detaining and deterring these pirate activities. So it has gone significantly down on the eastern coast, but still a huge threat. It has actually seen an increase on the West African side, specifically around the Gulf of Guinea, but with UN interventions also assisting in that, I think it is also going quite well. Now with conflicts in the Red Sea, obviously shipping routes being rerouted around South Africa is at risk of increased illicit crime activities because we also have a large coastline, more than 3,000 kilometers. So establishing a capability that can efficiently and cost effectively address these concerns and deter these criminal activities is a huge requirement for all governments globally. And that's the market we then entered into. So I think the latest vessel that we launched was the Milkor Interceptor, a 30-meter offshore patrol vessel. We also moved into that sphere. But it has the added advantage that it has an onboard unmanned aerial vehicle. So it can either be a vertical takeoff and lift fixed wing UAV, so it takes off vertically and lands, but then it flies a fixed wing operation with a range of 250 kilometers around the vessel itself for added surveillance capabilities and interception capabilities.
Do these run on fuel or on batteries?
There's a combination of them. So some of them run only on electrics, on batteries. Some of them can be a hybrid version. So for vertical takeoff and landing, you typically have your electric motors. And then when it flies in a fixed wing configuration, you have an internal combustion engine. There's also some rotary wings, for example, that run on batteries or fuel is essentially itself as well. Also outfitted with some smaller interception vessels that can then do long-range patrol operations, do long-range surveillance operations, and also then intercept and board these vessels that are doing illegal activities. So a niche market that we are moving into, competing with large companies that are producing vessels of 120 meters. It's very difficult to do because the capital injection is really difficult. It's quite a lot of
proper
money.
Shipbuilding at that size.
Proper shipbuilding, you need a proper facility, you need a dedicated team of more than 500 people. So moving up slowly, but specifically identifying a niche market where you can have the same output with a less input. So essentially having the same level of surveillance capability with a smaller vessel, but more of them at a reduced cost is essentially what we're marketing. And to the African continent, that's a huge advantage. Not just South African Navy that is cash strapped at the moment. It is predominantly around the African continent because they have all of these activities and so many responsibilities shared between not just the defense side, but also between the whole defense and security cluster for the entire country. So providing them with solutions essentially that can help them save costs, but also increase their operational efficiency and surveillance capabilities is essentially what we're doing at the moment. So also really proud of the achievements we've made there. Production is going quite well as well.
So do you have vast factories where you manufacture all of the stuff? Is a lot of it made offshore to order, or do you make it all here in South Africa?
So all of the weapon systems, the land vehicle systems, and the UAV capabilities, our aerial capabilities, which we'll touch on now, is manufactured in South Africa. So we have our regional or global head office, if you want to call it like that, in Centurion, where we manufacture our weapon systems. We also have another facility in Waterloo, where we do manufacture the vehicles.
Waterloo, that's also in Pretoria.
Yes, where we manufacture the vehicle systems. And then we have a few facilities in Cape Town, centered around the Cape Town airport.
Okay.
That is predominantly responsible for the full in-depth development and manufacturing of the UAV systems and all its subcomponents that goes with it. And one thing we found is that a lot of these systems are very difficult to acquire on a subcomponent level, right? So many of the companies around the world, typically there's only a few companies that do not do this, but predominantly I would say about 80% of companies typically would go and do an integration capability. So they would develop a product, but essentially getting a few commercial off-the-shelf items and just integrating it into a certain platform and then shipping it on. We have not gone that route. Specifically on the UAV, if you look at that, we had to establish a capability where from the ground level upwards, develop an in-house capability for every single subcomponent that has to go with it. So that includes the airframe development, the composite manufacturing that goes into that, all the mechanical parts that goes into an airframe, all of the software, hardware, and firmware we also do have to develop ourselves, and all of the mission control software and mission command systems alongside the radio communications as well. So it's a large team now.
How many people?
We are in Cape Town specifically, just on the UAV portfolio, so our air systems. It's about 400 people at the moment.
Wow.
So all South African employees sourced from, I think,
you must have some very specialist skills. I mean, firmware development.
Yeah. So we are actively recruiting, I think, some of the best of the best in engineering there is. So from some of the top universities in South Africa, the requirements to enter into that specific division is extremely, extremely high.
What sort of skills are you looking for? What university qualifications are you looking for when you hire?
It depends on which division, right? So,
of course.
So if the unmanned aerial vehicle, the Milkor 380 at the moment, is our flagship product, there's few new developments that will subsequently follow as well, but predominantly that's their main focus. Up until from 2019 to 2023, we just did development work on it, so testing, internal testing and things like that. And in 2023, we started flying this in collaboration with the Department of Defense, Arms Corps, and the South African Air Force, using some of their facilities and airspace, essentially to be able to conduct our testing under their safety review board as well. Since then, it's moved on to an industrial cycle, right? So now we need people, for example, that are doing manufacturing, that are doing logistic support, that are doing integration work, that are doing actual aircraft maintenance engineers and those kinds of associations. It's a fully fledged company with its own sub-support system that needs to be provided as well. So one thing we also identified quite early on is the requirement and the lack of skills pertaining to drone pilots and drone operators of this size. It's easy to fly a DJI drone. Takes a 2-minute video on YouTube.
It's not that easy to fly a DJI drone, I can assure you. But I can imagine that this is much more complex.
Compared to this, there's so many different subsystems. You have to have a full breakdown from basic flight theory, air traffic communications, all the way up to the actual system itself and then operating it. So the training level is extremely high, and obviously we provide that to government entities, so it has to be on the right standard. So the training cycle typically lasts 6 months. In South Africa, we had to establish a facility with facilitators and trainers for that as well, just to accommodate them and house them for 6 months.
So the skills you need, I mean, it must be computer science, software engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, those types of skills.
Yes, and then there are some niche skills as well. For example, in electrical and electronic engineering, there's also an RF signals engineer and systems engineer. Those two predominant, those are the scarcest
RF engineers. Okay.
RF engineers are extremely difficult to find. So if any RF engineers are listening, please apply. We need some more of you.
Right.
And then systems engineers. You can imagine that the coherent system, so systems and subsystems inside this UAV. So how all of the automation and autonomization of the UAV actually happens is through a multitude of computing processes built into the aircraft that are responsible for certain functions, right? And alongside that, you also have to have software that controls those interfaces. So a systems engineer essentially is established to regulate the complete, comprehensive overview system on a detailed level, prescribing what the software developer has to do and what the hardware developer has to do and how these two would interface. So a multitude of roles and responsibilities ranging from finance to logistic support to RF engineers, which are very difficult to get.
Let's talk about the Milkor 380 UAV. As we've determined, this is not a DJI style drone. This is a very large product. Maybe just give us a bit of a feel for the specs of this thing. How big is it? How much does it weigh? What's in it?
Yeah, so the Milkor 380 is officially the largest UAV to be developed, flown and tested and manufactured on the African continent. It's a huge feat, I think, regardless of where we sell to and who we supply to. I think it's a huge feat for the skills and a testament of the skills that are still within this country. This UAV essentially is 18.6 meters in wingspan, 9 meters in length. It weighs 1.5 tons on maximum weight, takeoff weight. Flies for 35 hours, and it has a range of 4,000 kilometers. So we had to develop...
That's not batteries alone.
That's definitely not batteries alone. It uses quite a lot of fuel. So some of its payload, obviously, so it has a 220 kilogram payload capability.
Does it use jet fuel as a matter of interest? Or
it actually uses a combination of two different variants. So you can use either one, whichever one is available, with some modifications to it. So you can either use 93 unleaded fuel, which you use.
Fill it up at the local garage.
And then it also has 110 LL F-gas. So it doesn't use jet fuel. Jet A1 fuel is usually commonly used on turbine engines. This is a piston, radial axle piston engine as well. It's commercially available, so there's a few spare parts and things like that that's also sorted. But yeah, this whole system essentially is developed specifically for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations, right? So main purpose is to fly around as high as possible and gather as much information as possible, but also sending that information back down to a ground control station in real time. Now, to allow that, we had to develop our own radio communication systems as well, which has a range of 250 kilometers in radius. So from a central command data link, essentially a ground data terminal, which can be either fixed to a cell phone tower or it can be a stationary containerized unit with its own power supply, you essentially have a range of 250 kilometers to communicate to.
Using what frequency?
So it's specifically in the C-band frequency, so between 4.5 and 5.5 gigahertz.
Oh, it's quite high frequency. I would have thought you'd actually use a lower frequency because of the range that you get out of it.
Yeah, so you can imagine now, because we use a higher frequency, the amount of power it consumes is quite high, the amount of heat it generates is quite high as well. So there's a few technical issues, and beyond that, it also uses satellite communication link-ups, right? So it's built in with satellite communications as standard, and then beyond your visual line of sight or relayed communications, you essentially have the capability to also then do satellite communication operations. So this, in essence, essentially allows you to do, if you have a terrestrial network, if you take South Africa as an example, typically you would need about 5 to 8 of these systems, depending on what type of operations you need. 5 to 8 different ground data terminals that might be required to cover the entire country, and you can essentially take off from any Air Force base and fly to any part of South Africa continuously with an automatic handover relay.
Is that in place now?
No, it's not in place, but it is possible.
It is possible, okay. I know the Home Affairs Minister, Leon Schreiber, has been talking about using UAVs to patrol South Africa's borders, which we know are terribly porous, particularly along the Zimbabwe border, but also other entry points. I suspect the Mozambique side as well is a problem. I presume when he's talking about doing that, he's talking about using large UAVs like the ones you manufacture here. Is that an application? Is that a good application for the Milkor 380, doing that sort of border surveillance to stop illegal crossings?
That's exactly. So the Milkor 380 essentially is the only capability that they should be looking at. However, there were a few tenders released, and I think it's mainly due to budget constraints, but for smaller type applications.
Okay.
Which will solve a part of the problem, right? The 380 in itself, although it's a significant feat technologically and its capabilities are renowned, but on its own, it will not be able to solve a comprehensive problem, right? You can have 24/7 surveillance. You can be able to use the information that you gather, stored and processed from the ground up, essentially to recognize patterns, identify behavioral changes, and recognize and identify illegal crossings that might happen across various different borders and entities. That being said, though, it is also required to have a local or close quarter surveillance capability. So, for example, if you have a border post or border crossing, for example, you might need some local drone coverage as well that you can immediately send out should there be...
To get a closer look at what's going on.
And these systems are less expensive to acquire, but they only cover in part. So as a part of the BMA's responsibility, they have a mandate to, within 10 kilometers from the border line and 10 kilometers outside of the borderline into foreign countries, to patrol those areas. Right now, they have significantly understaffed capabilities, both from a human resources and an equipment perspective. So using technologies like the Milkor 380, for example, will solve a multitude of their problems inherently at the moment. This system can fly, as I mentioned, for 4,000 kilometers in a single flight. Right?
That's incredible. I mean, that's Messina to Cape Town and back again,
yes,
plus some.
Plus some. And it does that by being extremely fuel efficient. It's designed as a glider type thing, which flies very slow, actually.
Yeah. It's actually quite high up, though. Its cruising altitude I saw here was something like 10,000 feet.
Yeah, so between 10 and 18,000 feet is the optimal range for the sensors on board. It has a maximum operational altitude of 23,000 feet and a service ceiling of 30,000 feet.
Wow, that's as high as aircraft, just about.
Just about below it. So it's still underneath that. It also has the capability, obviously, to interact with different aircraft, civilian aircraft as well. But essentially, this type of technology can allow you to cover a large degree of the borders and essentially recognize patterns in which you can then identify hotspots for crossing. And then you reinforce those things with the limited resources you have. So although there is a large drive, I think, from the Minister of Home Affairs and the BMA essentially to implement the technologies in unmanned aerial vehicles, at the moment is only on a smaller scale, which I think partly solves the problem. But in the long run, I think it is better to look at a system like this, which is actually designed for what it needs to do.
Yeah. So typically what are some of the other applications? Border management is obviously a very big one. You mentioned wildlife and I presume in anti-poaching operations as well. I presume it has military operations as well?
Definitely. So this UAV is designed as a multi-purpose platform, right? So essentially allowing primarily for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance applications across all defense and security clusters. So that includes operations on the border, specifically for border maintenance and border monitoring. So identifying possible threats using the multitude of sensors available on the system for surveillance capabilities to intercept and identify these possible targets, illegal crossings, illegal activities. The same technology can also be used and implemented for anti-poaching activities, identifying possible poachers in the Kruger National Park, for example, or Addo Elephant Park, things like that. It is also predominantly and commonly known around the world, UAVs offer a larger degree of operational efficiency and cost efficiency compared to maritime surveillance. Right? In the past, they would outfit a Cessna Caravan with a multitude of the same sensors that we have on board and then fly these operations. But a manned pilot can only fly for about 6 hours continuously before being completely fatigued. With this system, you have a continuous surveillance of 35 hours, right? So when you start performing these flight portfolios and the semi-autonomy that it has built in, essentially that puts a less strain on it, and you can have shift intervals from the ground control station.
Because I suppose in many instances you want that UAV up over a particular area for weeks on end, sometimes months on end.
Correct, and you want to be in the air as much as possible for a lower cost.
How long does it take to recharge the batteries?
There's the UAV uses fuel.
Fuel only? I see. Okay.
Just refuels.
Okay, just refuels. So it can be up again very quickly.
As quickly as your Boza can fill it up, as quickly as you can put the 300
Just land at the local BP garage, top it up, and off it goes again.
Exactly. It's similar, almost like that. But essentially what it allows you to do is have a complete 24/7 capability. Typically when we sell this platform from one ground control station or one base, you would not just sell one system from the ground and one new aircraft, right? You would typically sell 2 or 3 aircraft minimum. A standard configuration is 3 aircrafts. And the reason is you would already prime the first one, right, to be ready to take off or actually take off. You can operate all 3 simultaneously, but you can actually take off as the one is coming into land and essentially continue the surveillance capability. So with 3 systems, essentially you can cover one sector in the country and you can have an aircraft in the air at a specific area at all times. Now, that is the beauty of it, right? And because this thing flies for 35 hours compared to manned surveillance in a maritime environment, it is a huge advantage, right? On the ocean itself, even just the topography of the ocean, the movement of the waves actually on your sensors from an EO/IR perspective, your electronic, optical, and infrared sensors, causes a lot of distortion and noise. So using something like a synthetic aperture radar or inverse synthetic aperture radar, it's a dual purpose sensor, that is relatively a new technology, commonly used on UAVs, but specifically for the maritime environment, it helps you identify objects in the ocean by eliminating some of the noise generated by these wave frequencies and things like that. So with the use of the combination of a high efficiency platform that is in the air constantly and an advancement in sensor capabilities and processing power, you essentially have a better coverage at a fraction of the cost. So for maritime applications, this can pertain to the Border Management Authority as well, but also to the Navy, in providing intelligence on the ground. Beyond that, obviously, it also is intended for military operations. So this UAV has a carrying capacity of 220 kilograms, which can specifically be used for weapon systems. So that includes laser-guided rocket systems, missile systems. It can include glide bombs and a variety of other electronic payloads used in a direct combat environment. Typically, these UAVs are at risk from surface-to-air missile systems. That's why they fly at really reasonably high altitudes, and you would typically rely on your sensors available to identify possible threats on the ground. You can also relay information back from ground forces. So, for example, if you have a special operations force on the ground busy with a UN operation or peacekeeping operation, you essentially can have body cameras and communication devices that are strapped onto the personnel itself, relaying that information, video, audio, and GPS locations back through the UAV to a mission command based in Pretoria, for example. And that can happen from anywhere in the world. So huge technological advancements when it comes to being informed about what is going on in real time. And then you can obviously use informed decisions to either use a strategic strike capability or an opportunistic engagement in identifying possible threats that could assist the people on the ground as well.
I realize you probably can't name specific clients, but can you give us an idea of where this has been deployed around the world? Is it being actively used here in South Africa, for example?
I can say this. So it's being flown and tested alongside the South African Air Force.
Okay.
In some of the Air Force bases in the military space that they have available. I can definitely not disclose any of the clients that we have sold this to previously or where it has been deployed.
But it's being used around the world already.
And it's, I don't want to...
You can't comment.
I can't comment on it. But I can say that it's being tested. So in this discussion, I think it is important to focus specifically on South Africa.
Sure.
Because us being a South African company, I think many companies will relate to this, right? We rely on political stability within the country and financial stability and peace, right? We rely on these things for our business and our economies to thrive. As a South African defense company, obviously we have a mandate and an important aspect to providing our defense and security clusters throughout the country on various fields to establish that peace and ensure the foundation is laid down for businesses to thrive. So the SANDF, the BMA, and the SAPS are primary customers, right? And it will always remain like that. If they are successfully and well equipped, but successful in their operations, it essentially allows our company also to build a bigger baseline. There's more foreign investment coming into. So
you work closely with them to develop the products?
Yes. So we are very often, we actually, not just on the UAV itself, but on all the other products that we offer, we would typically engage with them from an initial requirement specification that they might identify a possible issue, right? And once they identify the issue, we would look at our internal capabilities, existing products, and make either some modifications to it or develop a completely new system that then addresses that concern immediately. It is also a comprehensive solution. As I mentioned, it's not just a one-size-fits-all. So typically you have to rely on partnering with other companies within the country or around the world to be able to provide the best possible equipment and solution for whatever they need.
I wanted to ask you, unrelated to Milkor, but I think everyone's been watching the Ukraine-Russia war with a great deal of interest, and every day we hear about how the drones are being used in those operations. I was fascinated to read just the other day how the Ukrainians are now stringing out kilometers of fiber optic cables connected to drones because the communication systems have been intercepted by the Russians. So they're listening for these, I'm going to get the description of this wrong, but they're listening for certain frequencies and they can determine the location of these drones. So they're using the RF signals to shoot them down. So now the Ukrainians are actually connecting fiber optics to the drones and sending them out over long distances. My question is, how crucial have drones and UAVs become in modern warfare?
It is essential, right? It's not just UAVs itself, it's the unmanning of things in general.
Okay.
there are two major benefits. There are some drawbacks, but there are two major benefits that far outweigh all of the drawbacks. The one being the operational efficiency. You can accurately carry out an operation with an unmanned system, be it an unmanned ground vessel, unmanned surface vessel, boat, or an unmanned aerial vehicle. You can more effectively, the probability of success using an unmanned system that is remotely operated is higher compared to a person in the heat of the operation, in close quarters, being able to perform the same function. The secondary function is obviously the reduced risk of lives, right? Which is a huge focus, I think, even in modern warfare, for many different countries around the world, including those two that you mentioned as well. The use of fiber optic drones, for example, is predominantly to do with radio interceptions and communication. It's also to do with GPS spoofing. Mm-hmm. Essentially what they typically do is they intercept the radio communications and feed false information about the GPS coordinates of the system. So as it flies, it actually corrects, but it corrects off course. And as it's moving off course, they can then intercept it when it's out of range. Those are at risk predominantly because they are quite small, right? So the technology capabilities that are built into them are on a micro scale.
And they don't get particularly high either, I presume.
Yes, so they are close range, number one, but they are also quite small. So the type of technology that's built into them is at risk of being jammed and spoofed. Okay. So in our system, for example, because we have developed our own radio communication systems, we have built in quite a few redundancies to accommodate for that. I don't think it's wise to mention which ones, but there's a multi-layer redundancy approach. So that should you lose communications with the UAV, it will either fly itself back and return home, or it will actually correct and align itself and re-establish a connection. There's a multitude of things that we have implemented for that. But we have the luxury of doing that purely because we have developed our own radio systems, and it's a larger platform, so you can have more systems on board. On smaller UAVs, especially what they are using it for now, I think it shows a lot of desperation for solving a problem with any means possible, right? There's no clear guidelines, and we're moving into a completely new era where a lot of the things we saw in sci-fi movies regarding warfare and using unmanned systems essentially is becoming a real life scenario and a real life approach.
I'm going to ask you where we're going in terms of tech and warfare. I mean, we're seeing this use of UAVs extensively in the Ukraine war, but I know the US military, and I'm sure militaries around the world are also investing a huge amount of money in artificial intelligence and baking this into UAVs and other military equipment. Where is all this going? What is warfare going to look like in 10, 20 years from now?
I'm not sure. But
possible to know.
What I can tell you is that the combination between the unmanning of things, for example, the thing is, computing power has significantly increased over the last 2 decades. And now there's an AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning, or algorithm detection, whatever you want to call it. But essentially, artificial intelligence, AI, is the commonly known term. All of these systems that are being developed, there's a massive boom in it now, right? It essentially allows you to make informed decisions semi-autonomously. Now, conventional warfare and conventional operations are still dictated under what is considered a war crime and what is not, right? But the boundaries are being pushed in many cases. And if you look at all of the conflicts at the moment around the world, in multiple areas, these boundaries are constantly being pushed and things. So I don't know if it will be regulated coherently, if the manufacturing and technological advancements in defense technology itself will be regulated more, or if we will see a completely new boom in terms of its capabilities. But the combination between artificial intelligence, so self-decision making, and unmanning of things could coherently change the entire landscape of war.
Because you start putting autonomous AI systems into robots and UAVs and other devices. To what extent do those systems have autonomy to make decisions on the battlefield, and when do humans get involved, and when should humans get involved?
Yeah, it's a very good question, right? And I think those boundaries are not clearly defined at the moment. I think that there are boundaries in place at the moment, but they are not clearly defined for the future, right? Because the technology did not exist. But should that be the case, that there are systems being developed that have that capability, it is not at that level yet, right? So, for example, UAV systems is called a man-in-the-middle system. it's not called an autonomous aircraft. I think many people make the association because of Hollywood films,
yes.
that they see these drones just take off by themselves, and AI and Terminator and these kind of things just.
But I wonder if that's where we're going.
I mean, the risk is there, and I think people have been experts in the AI field specifically have been predominantly concerned about that. The full autonomy of an artificial intelligence is a very dangerous thing, I think, and combining that with weapon systems is even more so. So at the moment, the regulations clearly stipulate that you have some semi-autonomous capabilities. For example, you can fly the aircraft will fly itself as dictated by the pilot sitting behind the thing. And I mean, if you have to fire a missile system, there's still a person that has to make the decision and press the button. It is not an autonomous thing. It is carefully considered and planned out by humans, which is important. And that, I think, will remain, as far as possible, the guidelines to continue doing so. There will be countries that push those boundaries coherently. And it's a responsibility, I think, for companies like ourselves to also investigate the countermeasures for such systems. I imagine though, if you're on the front line and there's movement on that front line, it's not like a Russia situation where you're sitting staring at each other, but there are actual active attacks going on, that you'd want to send in the robots, the AI robots first, before the humans, to see what's going on and to ascertain what the risk is and all that sort of thing, and send the humans in afterwards once the AI agents, once the robotics have been in and had a look at what the situation is. The issue is that although there might be some good applications like you mentioned now, right, a reduced risk of human lives, you can send something in, and then if you lose it, there's no humans that were lost in the process, or no soldiers. That is a definite advantage, right? But at which point do you draw the boundary, right? How do you then use these systems for terrorist operations? Do they fall in the hands for intelligence operations, if you want to call it like that as well? So it's a very difficult thing to monitor and control. And I think we have to rely quite heavily on the regulations set in place by the South African government, but by the UN as a whole, in terms of technological advancements and capabilities being developed. Every year, we see an increase in AI capabilities, like you said, baked into military defense systems. But at the moment, it's just to increase the operational efficiency. I think for some years still to come, that'll be the case. And I do not think that we will have to worry about being terminated soon. I do, however, believe that there are some advantages, right, to these things. But it is difficult to predict. I think we're in uncharted territory at the moment. Technology has never been developed so quickly. It's rapidly being developed.
The world does seem to be advancing more rapidly now than it has at any point in the last 20 or 30 years.
I think it's a combination of things, right? The internet obviously played a huge role in that. Social media has also played a large role in that as well. And I think the more popularity AI, for example, gets on social media, the more interested parties you have. If I look at our company as an example, right? If you study in mechanical engineering in South Africa, which I also studied myself, you will often see that your forecast path will either to be going into the mining industry or the petroleum industry or some sort of manufacturing industry or HVAC or things like that. Your knowledge of the defense industry in South Africa might be very limited towards the exposure that you might have. Maybe you have some family members that have exposed you, but if you do not have that in place, the typical path would be to follow the most mainstream routes, where the defense industry, in actual fact, actually might be a very feasible thing to build your career in. It's a very lucrative the industry that is a requirement globally and will be for many years to come.
Wherever, sadly, I suspect.
So I think that is a good example of how the sharing of information, for example, can lead to more interested parties, which also adds to the rapid development of these things as well. So, I mean, we are in uncharted territory at the moment, and I do not know what the foreseeable future holds. But for us as a company, obviously, we're going to continue investing into new technologies, building on our capabilities, and essentially ensuring that we have efficient operations and efficient solutions for governments to deal with their respective challenges adequately.
Lastly, I'd like to just touch on the final area that you focus on, which we haven't discussed yet, and that's cybersecurity, and I presume elements of cyber warfare as well. What is your involvement in cybersecurity, and do you actively get involved in helping governments fight off cyber attacks, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so that is exactly it, what we're doing. We're helping governments fight off cyber attacks. I think 2 years back, there was a data leak from an anonymous group of hackers that hacked into the Defense Department, so the DoD, and leaked about 16 terabytes worth of information, classified information, which is a huge...
Here in South Africa?
Yeah. And I think it was well contained, meaning that the information essentially was not that classified, it was well contained. But it essentially did pose a risk, right? How can a government agency responsible for defense operations as the head of the defense and security cluster be hacked? And I think that there are many such porosities around government entities and departments throughout South Africa and the rest of the continent as well. So cybersecurity has been a predominant thing and has been a growing interest from many government side as well. The implementation of AI technologies also to identify these possible threats in real time and then respond to them autonomously is also a huge thing as well. So we have essentially taken upon ourselves to develop a internal capability of securing a network or department. Right? And that ranges from all of the network communications to the infrastructure that you need, to the devices that is linked to that system, and then how the information is stored and contained, also preventing and identifying possible attacks. We do not deal in cyber warfare.
Just purely responsive, operation.
Defensive, protecting.
So do you run a security operations center on behalf of your clients where you'd monitor their networks? And
well, typically, no, we do not monitor their networks. We typically set up either forensics capability that either identifies possible threats, determines the point of origin, and then does interception operations on that, or just does a monitoring station for the country as a whole. For example, ports of entry, you need some sort of capability to ensure that your airports aren't hacked because they have access to immigration documents, for example. So you need these capabilities well established throughout your ports of entry and various departments within government. And they need to be fortified, in essence, to protect the general public against the leaking of protected information.
So, I mean, there's been so many attacks on government institutions in South Africa in the last while. Central government departments. We had that big Transnet hack about what was a ransomware attack a couple of years ago. Would you help organizations like that defend themselves against ransomware and get to the bottom if they have been hacked?
Exactly that.
That sort of stuff.
It's exactly that. So essentially we will go and do a thorough analysis about possible threats that happened in the past, possible attacks like that you mentioned now as well, and then identify a feasible solution that will be carried out either in a phased approach or as a multitude, just an implementation coherently. These things allow you essentially to protect yourself, right? But it is not redundant and it is not fortified in essence. There are still methods of doing this, right? So it's a continuous partnership. It's not just something that you implement once off. It is a continuous investment into identifying new capabilities that are being used in cyber warfare activities, and then fortifying your systems even deeper and on another level. So it is a long-term relationship. It is very difficult to get into partnerships with the government on that level because they obviously have a jurisdiction within themselves also to protect the information that they are withholding. So in essence, it is a difficult thing. It takes a long while to build a trusted network of people that allows you into the inner circle in securing these networks. So it's unfortunately a real requirement at the moment, but something that is implemented quite slowly because of the risk factor that involves it as well. But yeah, throughout the continent as a whole, there are many interested parties in this as well. So dealing directly with government security or cybersecurity capabilities, fortifying your network and the entirety of it to protect against data leaks and infiltrations.
Yeah. And do you work with law enforcement to go after cyber crooks as well?
No, we do not.
No.
We can, but no, we do not.
Okay. And cyber warfare, defense against cyber warfare, that's not something you do. It's more defending against ransomware hackers, for example.
Correct.
Not so much if Russia decided to attack South Africa.
If Russia decided to attack South Africa, we would not have any companies that are capable of protecting against it.
Okay.
There's a few countries like that as well.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, not the usual sort of stuff we talk about on the TechCentral Show, but I think our audience is going to find this very valuable. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Daniel du Plessis is Communications Director at Pretoria-based Milkor. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.